The Atlantic was a graveyard. By the spring of 1943, the ocean stretched like an endless battlefield, waves rolling over steel tombs that once carried men who believed they would never die. Beneath those waves, the German U-boats hunted, silent and invisible, preying on convoys that tried to bring life to a starving Britain. Among them was U-456, commanded by Captain Lieutenant Otto Wendt, a 28-year-old veteran who had seen more death than most men twice his age. His crew called him Eisenherz, Ironheart, not because he was cruel, but because he never showed fear. For 3 years they had stalked the Atlantic from the shadows, ghosts in the deep. But the tide was turning. The Allies now ruled the skies. New radar, faster destroyers, depth charges that could find a submarine even in the blackest water. Every patrol felt like suicide. Inside the narrow hull of U-456, the air was thick with diesel fumes, sweat, and nerves. Men spoke in whispers. The engines hummed like a heartbeat beneath their boots. Wendt stood by the periscope, watching the horizon. Surface bearing west, 2 merchant ships, and 1 destroyer escort. He didn't smile. He simply said, "Prepare torpedoes 1 and 2. The crew moved like machines. No emotion, no hesitation. They had done this 100 times. Through the periscope, Wendt saw the convoy, small silhouettes against the mist. He could almost imagine the men aboard them drinking coffee, thinking the sea was calm. "Fire 1, he ordered. A hiss. Then, "Fire 2. 2 streaks of compressed air raced away beneath the waves. Moments later, a distant explosion tore through the fog. One of the merchant ships erupted in flame. The men in the sub barely reacted. Another kill, another name in the captain's log. But this time, something was different. The sonar operator shouted, "Destroyer turning! Coming straight for us!" Wendt didn't flinch. "Crash dive, depth 90 meters." The alarm wailed, red lights flashed, and the sub tilted sharply downward. Everything rattled. Mugs and tools flew off shelves. Men grabbed pipes and rails to steady themselves as the Atlantic swallowed them whole. The destroyer's propellers screamed overhead, hunting. Then came the first depth charge. Boom! The pressure slammed through the steel hull like a hammer. Then another. Boom! 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 The lights flickered. Pipes burst. The men pressed their hands to their ears as the roar filled the narrow space. "Hold her steady," Wendt shouted. "Trim tanks to port." The submarine groaned as it descended deeper. 100 meters. 120. 140. The hull creaked under the pressure. Every man knew what that sound meant. One more blast, and the ocean could crush them like a tin can. Then, silence. Only the hiss of air vents and the nervous breathing of 50 trapped men. The destroyer was circling above, waiting. For hours they lay still in the dark. No one spoke. No one moved. At last, Wendt whispered, "Surface at nightfall. We'll slip away north." When the submarine broke the surface that night, the stars looked unreal. Cold lights scattered over a black sea. The diesel engines sputtered back to life. Men climbed onto the deck for fresh air, faces pale in the moonlight. They thought they were safe. Until the lookout shouted, "Aircraft!" 2 white dots appeared in the sky, growing larger every second. "Dive! Dive! Dive!" The engines roared, but it was too late. The first bomb exploded 50 meters off the port side. The second struck near the conning tower, tearing open the pressure hull. Water gushed in. Men screamed, "Flooding compartment 2! Pressure dropping! Close the bulkhead!" But the ocean was faster. Within minutes, U-456 was sinking, spiraling down into blackness. Wendt gave the order no submarine captain ever wanted to say. "Abandon ship." The escape hatch blew open, and freezing seawater poured in. One by one, the men fought their way out, lungs burning, rising through the icy dark, toward the faint shimmer of moonlight above. When Wendt surfaced, gasping, the submarine was gone. Only debris floated on the waves, oil, wood, the bodies of friends. He counted maybe 20 survivors, clinging to wreckage in the freezing water. The bomber was still circling, its spotlight sweeping the sea. The men braced for death. But then, something impossible happened. The plane didn't fire again. Instead, it dropped a flare, and then a small rubber raft. Inside the raft was a red box marked U.S. Navy Emergency Supply. Went blinked, barely believing it. Inside were rations, blankets, even morphine. He looked at the others, half dead, shivering, terrified. Then he whispered, "The enemy has shown mercy." Hours later, the same bomber guided a nearby destroyer toward their position. The survivors were hauled aboard by the very men they'd tried to kill a day earlier. As Wendt lay shivering on the deck, wrapped in an American blanket, he looked at the sailor who handed him a cup of hot coffee. The man smiled. "Welcome to the surface, Captain." Wendt didn't reply. He just stared at the steam rising from the cup. In that moment, he realized the war had changed. The enemy wasn't what he'd been told. The destroyer's deck felt like another world. After days trapped beneath the ocean, the survivors of U-456 now stood blinking in the harsh light of dawn. Their uniforms clung to them, stiff with salt water and oil. Every breath burned from the cold. The American sailors moved quickly but not cruelly. They handed out blankets, guided the half-conscious Germans toward the medical bay, and poured hot broth into trembling hands. There were no jeers, no mockery, only the quiet discipline of men doing their duty, not as victors, but as rescuers. Kapitän Leutnant Otto Wendt lay on a stretcher, his face pale, his lips blue. When he awoke hours later, he found himself in the ship's infirmary. A soft voice spoke English nearby, low and calm. "Easy there, Captain. You're lucky to be alive." It was the ship's doctor, Lieutenant James Harris. He was young, maybe 30, with kind eyes that didn't seem to belong in a war. He was tending to a wounded German sailor whose arm had been shattered by shrapnel. Wendt tried to sit up, but Harris gently pressed a hand on his shoulder. "You'll live. Some frostbite, some bruising, but you'll live." Wendt frowned. Why help us?" Harris looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "Because the sea already punished you enough." Those words hit Wendt harder than any explosion. For days, the crew of U-456 remained aboard the American destroyer, USS O'Bannon, as it made its way toward the Azores. The Germans were confined to a small section of the deck, but even there, they saw things they'd never imagined. They saw black and white sailors working side by side, laughing together. They saw officers eating the same food as their men. They saw a ship run not by fear, but by respect. One night, as the ocean calmed, Wendt leaned against the rail beside one of his surviving crewmen, Hans Kruger, a 20-year-old torpedo operator. "Captain," Hans said softly, "they treat us like men, not animals." Wendt nodded. "It confuses me. They even gave me coffee," Hans continued, shaking his head. "I don't think I've tasted coffee since 1941. They both laughed quietly. The first laughter since the day they sank. Later that evening, the destroyer's captain, Commander Robert Hale, came down from the bridge. He was tall, calm, with eyes that carried both authority and exhaustion. He approached Wendt without guards, without hostility. "Captain Wendt," he said, offering a cigarette, "I hear you were quite a hunter out there." Wendt hesitated, then accepted the cigarette. "I followed orders," he replied. Hale nodded slowly. "So did I." He took a deep drag and looked out at the moonlit waves. "But sometimes I wonder if the sea knows who's right or wrong." For a moment, the two enemies just stood there. Two men who had spent years trying to outwit and kill each other, now sharing silence under the same stars. The next morning, an American chaplain held a short service on deck for the sailors lost in the sinking of U-456. The Americans stood in formation, hats removed. The German survivors stood beside them, heads bowed. The chaplain read a psalm. "They that go down to the sea in ships, these see the works of the Lord and his wonders in the deep." When he finished, Captain Hale stepped forward. "These men were our enemies," he said. "But they fought with courage. The sea has claimed their souls. Let us remember them as sailors, not as monsters." A single wreath was lowered into the water. For Wendt and his men, it was the first time anyone had honored their dead without hatred. That night, As the ship moved silently through the waves, the German prisoners were given a small corner of the mess hall to sleep. A few American sailors came by, offering cigarettes, bread, and even photos from home. One showed his baby daughter. Another offered a piece of chocolate. Hans, the young torpedo operator, held it as if it were gold. "They told us Americans were greedy," he whispered. "If this is greed, I wish the whole world were greedy." For Wendt, each act of kindness tore a hole in the armor of ideology he had worn for years. He had been trained to believe mercy was weakness, that compassion had no place in war. But here, on a ship that should have been his tomb, he found both. The following morning a storm rolled in, waves rising like mountains. The destroyer pitched violently, and one of the German sailors, still weak from exposure, was nearly thrown overboard. Before anyone could react, an American deckhand lunged forward, grabbed him by the collar and pulled him back. Both men collapsed, drenched, gasping, but alive. When the storm passed, Wendt approached the sailor who had saved his man. "You risked your life for him," Wendt said quietly. The American shrugged. "He's human, ain't he?" Simple words. But they stayed with Wendt. By the time the destroyer reached the Azores, the German survivors had been changed. The fear in their eyes was gone, replaced by something else. Something that looked a lot like shame, and maybe hope. As they were escorted onto transport ships bound for America, Captain Hale shook Wendt's hand. "For what it's worth, Captain," Hale said, "you fought well. I hope when this is all over, men like you help rebuild what's left of your country." Wendt looked at the American officer, the man who had hunted him, defeated him, and saved him. "Maybe," he said softly, "you've already started that." As the transport pulled away, Wendt stood on deck, watching the destroyer fade into the mist. For the first time in years, he felt something he hadn't known since before the war. Peace. He turned to his crew. "Remember this," he told them. "They treated us like men. When the war is over, we must remember that mercy." And deep down, even the ocean seemed to echo him. Calm, endless, forgiving. The journey to America took 14 days. The Atlantic stretched endlessly in every direction, a gray horizon where sky and sea became one. For the men of U-456, now prisoners of war, it felt like crossing from one life to another. They were no longer hunters of the deep, no longer soldiers of the Reich. They were simply men, tired, silent, watching waves that seemed to wash away everything they had once believed. At night, Otto Wendt lay awake in the hold of the transport ship, listening to the rhythmic thrum of the engines. The same sound that once meant pursuit and death now meant survival. Around him, his crew whispered in the dark. Some spoke of home, some spoke of guilt, some said nothing at all. On the seventh night, Wendt sat by a porthole and watched the stars. For the first time, he didn't see enemies or borders, just the vastness of the world. He thought of the American sailor who had pulled one of his men from the storm, of the chaplain's words about mercy. He realized something simple, something terrifying. They were not monsters. When the ship finally docked in New York Harbor, the prisoners were stunned. The skyline rose before them like something from another planet. Towers of steel and glass untouched by war. The harbor buzzed with life. Ferries, tugboats, merchant ships loaded with supplies. Wendt had imagined ruins, rationing, fear, the same misery that had consumed Europe. But what he saw instead was abundance, confidence, peace. As they disembarked under American guards, a few civilians watched from the pier. Nobody jeered, nobody spat. Children pointed, curious rather than hateful. An old man even tipped his hat. For soldiers raised to believe the world hated them, it was disorienting. They were loaded onto trains bound for Camp Hearn, Texas, one of hundreds of POW camps scattered across America. The journey took days, across green fields, wide rivers, and small towns where people lived as if the war were just a story from far away. At every station, they saw things that broke their idea of the world. Women driving trucks, black and white workers unloading freight together, stores filled with food, people laughing. One young sailor, Hans Kruger, stared out the window and said quietly, "We were told they were starving." Another replied, "If this is starvation, what were we fighting for?" When they arrived at Camp Hearn, they braced for humiliation. Barbed wire, barking guards, starvation. Instead, they found wooden barracks with electric lights, hot showers, and beds with actual mattresses. They were issued clean clothes marked PW in black letters. Then came something truly unthinkable. Lunch, stew, bread, real butter, coffee. One prisoner broke down crying at the sight of it. Captain Went sat at the long wooden table, staring at his tray. "It's better than the officers' rations on my submarine," he said. "Better than home." The camp commandant, Lieutenant Colonel Stiles, greeted them in fluent German. He explained the rules. They would work, study, and live under the Geneva Convention. They would be treated with respect, as long as they acted the same. Some of the men laughed bitterly. Others didn't believe him. But over the weeks that followed, the promise proved true. They were allowed to write letters home. They could borrow books from the camp library. They even received pay in canteen tokens for labor, enough to buy cigarettes, soap, chocolate. One Sunday, the camp chaplain invited them to attend church. Most refused, but a few went, curious. Inside, American and German voices sang the same hymn, "A mighty fortress is our God." Went stood in the back, listening. For the first time, the words didn't sound like nationalism. They sounded like forgiveness. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. The prisoners worked on nearby farms, harvesting cotton, picking fruit, repairing fences. They saw how American farmers treated their own laborers, fairly, kindly, even the ones who weren't white. Went noticed something else too: the laughter. The ease with which Americans joked, disagreed, and still worked together. In Germany, obedience was everything. Here, freedom didn't seem chaotic. It seemed strong. One afternoon, while fixing a fence, an old Texan farmer handed Went a bottle of water and said, "You boys ain't my enemies anymore. You're just men working under the same sun." That night, Went wrote in his journal, "They defeated us with food and kindness. They won without hatred. The sea showed us mercy once, but here on land, I think I've seen something greater." As 1945 drew to a close, the war officially ended. The men of U-456 were told they would soon be sent home. Some cheered, others fell silent, unsure what home even meant anymore. On their last night in camp, the Americans organized a small farewell gathering. The prisoners played a song on makeshift instruments, a slow, aching melody that drifted into the warm Texas air. When it ended, Lieutenant Colonel Stiles raised his glass. "You came here as enemies," he said. "You leave as men who understand peace. That's a victory for both of us." Went stood, hesitant, then saluted, not out of obedience, but respect. "Perhaps," he said softly, "we learned too late that strength without compassion is nothing." The next morning, the train carried them east, back toward ships that would return them to a ruined Germany. As the camp disappeared behind them, Went looked out at the endless horizon and thought of the men who had died in the sea, and the ones who had saved them. The ocean had once been his enemy. Now it was his teacher. He turned to Hans beside him. "When they ask what we learned," Went said, "tell them mercy floats better than hate." Hans smiled faintly. "Will they believe us?" Went looked at the sky. "They will, one day." Years later, long after the war, a letter arrived at a small naval office in Maine. It was written in careful English, signed by Otto Went. It read, "To Commander Hale, you once told me the sea doesn't know who's right or wrong. Perhaps you were right, but men do, if they choose to." Moral: sometimes the greatest victories in war aren't won with weapons, but with mercy. The men of U-456 didn't just survive the Atlantic, they survived themselves.